Best way to get a lot of followers on social media, bash Israel. What's the best way for an Israeli?
You know, my social media has been flatlining. Maybe I'll try it. Maybe it'll work.
You know, if you're an Israeli academic that hasn't made it in other places and you want to move ahead academically in a European institution, bash Israel. If you are a young legal expert and you want to move ahead in the international court system, bash Israel.
I just want to be clear to our listeners, this is not career advice. Hello and welcome to State of a Nation with me, Eylon Levy. It has been a week of dizzying developments here in the Middle East as President Trump lands here, seemingly in an attempt to reach some grand bargain that will end wars and bring peace to the Middle East. But as always, there is a lot of spin doing the rounds because so much is at stake. Here to help me break down this week's events is Asher Fredman, the Executive Director of the Misgav Institute for National Security. Am I getting that right?
Correct.
And former senior official at the Israeli Strategic Affairs Ministry. We're recording this podcast the morning after Edan Alexander was returned home, thank God. 584 days in hell. The 20-year-old lone soldier from Tenafly, New Jersey, was released, not as part of a ransom between Israel and Hamas, but thanks to the efforts of the United States, working directly with Hamas, working with Qatar, and of course, the spin machine has been jumping into action. This is the first thing I want to talk with you about today. What do we know about the conditions for which Edan Alexander was released from the bowels of Gaza? Was there a quid pro quo?
This is obviously a joyous day to see Edan Alexander back home. As a former lone soldier from the United States, it's especially gratifying. We know that the Trump administration, President Trump himself, put a lot of pressure on the mediators, particularly on Qatar, in order to have this release just as he arrives today in the region. We know that the United States and Israel are working on a new humanitarian mechanism in order to begin bringing the humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip in a way that doesn't reach the hands of Hamas. We know that Israel is stating explicitly that it hasn't agreed to any particular kind of ceasefire, other kinds of quid pro quo. I think each side, as you pointed out, is selling it, is presenting it in the way that serves their interests.
Yeah, the first thing you said is really the important one, that this deal came about because the United States pressured the mediators directly, right? This happened because Qatar told Hamas to free Edan Alexander, and Qatar is telling Hamas to hold on to the other hostages because Qatar, as Hamas's number one patron, it seems perfectly plain, has been lobbying for a ransom that would leave Hamas in power, free to plot more October 7th massacres. That's where the pressure needs to be, right? On the mediators, on the patrons, the so-called mediators, the patrons that have so much leeway over Hamas. Clearly it worked in this case and it needs to work with the other ones. But I'm trying to understand, how the different parties are spinning the joyful release of Edan Alexander. Of course, there's always a media angle. Just today, the family said he's not going to Doha after all, but there was a whole 12-hour period in which it looked like we were going to witness the most macabre hostage release ceremony of all, with Edan Alexander forced to fly to Qatar to kiss the ring, genuflect in front of the patrons of the terrorist group that held him captive for 584 days. So that photo opportunity is not going to happen. He decided it's not going to happen. His health condition isn't there. But let's look at how the parties are trying to spin this event. We've got the US, President Trump, saying that this was a step taken in good faith towards the United States and the efforts of the mediators. He's not taking credit for putting pressure on Qatar. Certainly not. He's just accepted a $400 million plane from Qatar. Meanwhile, you have Israel saying that this was achieved thanks to a combination of Israel's military pressure and diplomatic pressure applied by President Trump. It's pushing the line. That's how we're going to get the rest of the hostages out. Hamas says that it's a quid pro quo for humanitarian aid, for supplies into Gaza, hoping to circumvent the new Israeli mechanism that's meant to get aid to the people who need it and make sure that Hamas can't steal it. So, what's really going on here?
So first of all, as you said, there are leaks upon leaks and media spins that are on other media spins. And if you're really following the minute by minute, hour by hour news cycle, it's almost impossible to know what's really going on. And there are all kinds of interests and people who want to promote their own agendas and misquotes. Everything has to, in order to understand what's really going on, it's really important to take a step back and look at the bigger picture and look at trends. Qatar's goal has always been to ensure that Hamas remains the dominant power in the Gaza Strip. It survives and it remains control of the Gaza Strip. The fact that Israel announced the Gideon's Chariots operation, which was designed to correct some of the strategic mistakes that Israel made in the past, which allowed Hamas to remain the dominant force on the ground and could potentially lead to Israel achieving its war goal of eliminating Hamas as the dominant military and governing actor in the Strip. That also, I think, did put pressure both on Hamas and on its Qatari patron that, wait, we need to figure out a way to stop this. We need to figure out a way to undermine this. At the same time, Qatar is extremely sensitive to its public image. President Trump and the people around him have warm relations with the Qataris, as you pointed out. President Trump's willingness to accept the plane, in a sense, it was sort of a win-win. President Trump arrives in the region. He has won the release of a U.S. hostage, and I don't doubt for a minute that he truly cares about the Israeli hostages in general and those with American citizenship in particular, and that's absolutely to his credit.
The last living American hostage, because Hamas is still holding onto the bodies of 4 American hostages it has already murdered and is trying to ransom them.
Correct. But you see that President Trump has made efforts to release American hostages around the world. It's an important issue for him. And the hostage families have met with President Trump many times over the last year, before he was elected, after he was elected, after he came to the White House. I do believe he cares about this issue deeply. He's a deal maker. He saw an opportunity to make a deal. He put pressure on Qatar. Qatar saw a way to counter the claims that it is a terror supporter, that to whitewash its terror support, to give a benefit to one of a number of benefits to the American president, and also to potentially forestall an Israeli operation that poses a threat to its Hamas proxy, or it's a Hamas the group that it sponsors, the group that represents its ideology on the ground. It was a win-win for everybody. And Hamas, we have to remember, has, according to estimates, between 20 to 23 other living hostages. It still has a lot of leverage. It believes that it might be able to reach some kind of discourse, some kind of channel with the Americans. So for it to release one of the remaining between 23 and 21 living hostages, counting Edan Alexander, was an acceptable price and risk for it to take.
Because what Israel is trying to do now is to give Hamas one last chance to buy an extension of the ceasefire. That's what the Witkoff framework is. You continue to release hostages. In exchange, we'll give you time. You know, I think Israel looks at this and says, we only really have 2 levers of influence over Hamas to force it to give up the hostages. One is military pressure, and they'll try to forestall that by letting hostages out. The other is controlling supplies into Gaza, because Hamas has been hijacking and it's been the main avenue, the main financial pipeline for Hamas. The third, potentially putting pressure on Hamas's patrons, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, cutting off their financial chains. Absolutely no willingness to do that in the Western world, because Qatar has brought such immense influence. You know, when you're donating a plane to the President of the United States, I think that's just the final nail in the coffin of any hope that the United States is going to do put any serious pressure on Qatar. You know, I think President Trump should say, I'll take the plane, but please put Hamas's leaders on it and then fly them to the United States to face to face justice. So what do you make of the Prime Minister's statement that military pressure is the way to get the hostages out? Because what we're hearing from some of the hostage families, and some support military pressure, but some hostage families, namely the Hostage Family Forum, the main representative group, says, no, the only way to get them out is a deal that will end the war in exchange for everyone. What do you make of that clash of narratives between the Prime Minister's approach and the families who are desperate for a ransom to be paid already?
I think that, first of all, I agree with your point. I think that, to be honest, and this might be a bit controversial, I can edit it out if you have to afterwards, but if a tenth of the pressure that had been directed at the Israeli government over the last 19 months regarding hostages had been put on Qatar, and if we had seen protests outside of Qatari embassies around the world, Qatar is ultra sensitive to its public image. And again, protests, demonstrations, totally legitimate, part of the debate, and certainly no claims to the hostage families are entitled to do whatever they feel is best. But from a strategic perspective, if even a small amount of that pressure had been on Qatar and had been on, presenting Qatar's image in the world as a supporter of terror, we might have seen more hostages out more quickly. Getting to your question.
Yeah, but by the way, I was asked this morning in an interview on the BBC World Service, doesn't this show a failure of Israeli diplomacy, right? The United States was able to do this, and Qatar is a mediator. What do you want from it? I said, well, Qatar has invested a huge amount of money and effort in presenting itself as a mediator, as a neutral party, as a peacemaker. The fact is that it condemned Israel on October 7th for the October 7th massacre while the massacre was still ongoing, and says that it's been trying to push ever since for a ransom that leaves Hamas in power. It is Hamas's patron. It isn't this neutral party, and I think it was a mistake at the beginning, the historians will tell, to basically let Qatar get off scot-free and not put pressure on Qatar. We gave up what could have been a very successful channel of leverage.
Absolutely. And by the way, here the fault is everyone. The fault is on the American side, but it's also very much on the Israeli side. We remember Israeli officials that praised Qatar's constructive role. People on both sides, I don't want to get into politics, but in the Qatar gate, there apparently were people around Prime Minister Netanyahu who were advising or working for Qatar, whether it had to do with their job in Israel, not that's a separate question, but also...
Which is insane. Working for the Prime Minister's office and receiving money from Qatar at the same time.
That's should be
no, definitely not if you work for the Prime Minister of Israel.
But also we have to remember people who were advising and supporting the hostage families were also counseling to treat Qatar with kids' gloves. So everybody, unfortunately, was saying, no, let's not harm the Qataris' image. Let's treat them with kids' gloves. Let's portray them as a constructive actor. And I think that was the wrong tactic. And unfortunately, I think we could have had better results earlier if there had been more pressure on Qatar. But what's really happening? Let's look at what the Prime Minister is saying, what the hostage families are saying, and what I think the Prime Minister
How do we reconcile this?
Is really trying to do. In my view, I think there is tension, perhaps a contradiction, between the two war goals of freeing a maximum amount of hostages and ending Hamas's rule in Gaza. Now, the Prime Minister is arguing that there's no tension, there's no contradiction. We can achieve both of those goals. Maximum military pressure is going to release as many hostages as possible. The Hostage Families Forum is doing the opposite in terms they are trying to minimize or ignore the actual consequences of what they are promoting. So they are saying stop the war, end the war, but what they are not saying, which is and let Hamas remain the dominant power in Gaza, and let them rebuild their again, not everybody understands all of the details, but essentially Hamas will remain either officially or de facto the main power in Gaza, and they will not agree to any ceasefire unless that includes reconstruction, which means reconstruction of their tunnels, of their military capabilities. Now, that might be a fair price to pay for a hostage.
And you absolutely cannot fault the hostages' families for saying do anything, literally pay any price, because we understand how the hostages are being tortured and starved and subjected to all sorts of horrific abuse in the tunnels of Gaza. They're saying pay any price. And that price, like ending the war, means, we need to be honest about what it means, and I'm not picking a side in this painful debate. I'm trying to present the dilemmas. Ending the war means leaving Hamas in power, letting construction supplies into Gaza so that they can rebuild the tunnels, rebuild their army, and plot the next October 7th. Now, that's a price that I think those who are on the side of ending the war for a comprehensive deal to get the hostages out try to minimize. And they try to minimize by saying, we can go back to the war afterwards, after all the hostages are out. And actually, if Hamas is demanding UN Security Council guarantees that it will remain in power, well, Hamas being Hamas, it will give us an opportunity, it will give us an excuse because they'll shoot rockets at us. But, what if the next excuse is another hostage-taking crisis? What if the next October 7th involves, and Hamas is not stupid, obviously it will do this, taking more hostages so that it knows that it will survive that war again. And I am personally torn because I want both, right? I want to bring back the hostages who were taken yesterday, and I want to stop more hostages being taken tomorrow. I want to free the hostages from the grips of this evil regime, and I want to make sure this evil regime can never threaten Israelis ever again. But then I say, hey, we've been checkmated. We've been checkmated. They have over 20 living Israeli hostages. They're being suffered to horrific abuse. Maybe they won this round. Maybe they won this round. We just have to pay the ransom that they're demanding and work out how to deal with it later. And that's such an Israeli thing, right? We're like, you have to save people now because it's now. It's not theoretical. It's not hypothetical. And we'll deal with the consequences of Hamas remaining in power later.
Absolutely. And I certainly don't blame any of the hostage families. And I've asked myself a number of times, what would I say? What would I do if, God forbid, it was one of my family members who was being held in the dungeons of Gaza? I also don't...
Wait, hang on. What do you think you would do? Like, what's your... Do you have an answer?
I don't. We've seen hostage families on both sides of the equation, those arguing for maximum concessions and those arguing for military pressure. Unfortunately, I think the latter don't get nearly as much media time or as many resources as the former. I don't know what I would do, to be honest, and I hope I'm never tested. I do think that we call maximum pressure on the Israeli government from a tactical negotiating perspective may be a mistake, and perhaps beyond the feelings and the emotions, which obviously are dominant, there should be more thought about tactically what is the right approach in order to get the outcome they want to. But I don't even blame people who are, I think it's fully legitimate people who say we should allow Hamas to survive in Gaza. Maybe we fight again later, maybe we don't fight again later, but get as many hostages out as possible. That's a totally legitimate and moral position. I just think that in the debate, neither side is recognizing the tensions and the consequences. I think what Netanyahu is actually trying to do is maximize both. He's so far he's realized it's been difficult to achieve maximum military victory, and it's been very difficult to achieve maximum release of hostages. And he's trying to do both, dismantle Hamas as much as possible with all of the Biden weapons boycotts and pressure and coalition considerations, and maximize the number of hostages released. And that's a tension that he's trying to navigate, but nobody's really talking about that. Each side is saying, this side is right, and the other side is totally misleading and immoral and wrong. Right.
Opinion is sort of divided into three. Those who say the most important thing is to defeat Hamas. Those who say the most important thing is to free the hostages. And those who say, hang on, they both go hand in hand, because the only way to get the hostages out is to continue putting military pressure on Hamas. But hang on, we've just unpacked how you think that those who support a comprehensive deal ransom to get all the hostages out, end the war, are not being totally forthcoming about what the consequences of that are, for understandable reasons, because they're absolutely desperate to get their children out of hell, and that's their role. And if it were my brother, my sibling, my parent, my child, do whatever it takes. But what about the other side? The side that is pushing for a resumption of the war, that is pushing for the Gideon's Chariots operation, which means go into Gaza, take territory, hold it until after you defeat Hamas, no more game of cat and mouse. The side that supports that military option, what do you think they're not being honest and forthcoming about?
What I think, I'll answer that question in just 1 second, but I do think one important point about that is they are correct insofar as the reason that Hamas has not yet been defeated is not because it's not possible, but it's because Israel hasn't applied the right strategies. And the Gideon's Chariot operation is a step in the strategy that will lead to that outcome of dismantling
Okay,
Hamas.
But let's separate two things. There's the question of whether the strategy was successful to defeat Hamas, and now we're shifting strategy to save Hamas. And there's the question of the hostages. What do you do about the hostages?
So to answer that question, I think what they're not being forthright about is the fact that this will make it less likely to reach a hostage deal, certainly in the near term. And I don't think why, because I think that Hamas is highly unlikely to agree to release more hostages when it fears for its survival. Hamas sees the hostages as a way to guarantee its survival as the dominant power in Gaza.
Yeah.
If it sees Israel is going all out, is truly committed to dismantling its military and governing capabilities, it doesn't have an incentive to release the hostages.
Other than to buy time.
Again, so it's a game. They can release one, they can release two, they can release three. It's a question of maximizing the number of hostages that we release. By the way, I think that Hamas will, I truly pray that I am wrong, but I believe that Hamas will never release all the hostages, because they always have in the back of their mind, well, Israel might find an excuse to restart the war, so we'll always keep a couple as negotiating. Insurance. But if we're talking about how we get the most out, it's probably true that Israel's saying, Hamas, survive, take aid, take fuel, take food, take construction materials, open the borders, will lead to more hostages being released, and Israel saying, no, we're going in, we're going to hold territory, we're going to find your infrastructure, we're going to take out your foot soldiers, we're going to remain until we uproot you.
Look, the tragedy is, I think everyone's right, okay? The hostage families are right when they say that the resumption of military activities endangers the hostages and puts their lives at risk. They're right, okay? There is a risk they could get killed in an airstrike. There is a risk Hamas decides it no longer needs them and executes them and puts a bullet through their head. They're right. But it may also be true that the only lever of pressure we have to get hostages out is military pressure, other than capitulating and paying the ransom that Hamas is demanding. And the only effective leverage that Israel has to get hostages back is also one that places them in mortal peril. And Hamas basically has us checkmated, where it says, if you want to get all the hostages out, and I'm not sure, again, there is a way to get all of them out because our enemy is evil, not stupid, okay? And we'll want to hold on to them for insurance. Hamas has an interest in basically saying, look, the only way you're going to get a serious number of hostages out is if we have guarantees that we get to remain in power. And here you have a lot of the international spin completely muddled. I saw one of the EU officials tweeting, this war must end. We need peace. Now's the time for a ceasefire. And I'm like, hang on. There's a difference between peace and a ceasefire. A ceasefire means the hostilities stop and Hamas is going to continue building up for the next round of conflict. Peace is peace. Sure, do we want peace with Gaza? Sure, if they're willing to recognize the border, disarm, have peace with Israel, great, but they don't want that. And that is not exactly what we're being offered at the moment. I want to bring up a column, an editorial I saw in The Economist this week, which had me tearing my hair out for so many reasons, and I want to get your take on it. The headline really caught my attention. I don't know whether this was written by our friend Dan Schulpfeffer or Greg Karlstrom, who wrote the editorial. The Economist, of course, doesn't put bylines. Headline was this: America should press Benjamin Netanyahu to accept a ceasefire, then press Hamas to disarm. And I was curious. America should press Israel to stop the war that has a goal, and then find a way to achieve that goal anyway without a war. So I was curious. What is The Economist proposing? How are we going to make Hamas disarm without a war to try to force it to disarm? And it's extraordinary. It claims this. First of all, it talks about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, where trucks have not been going on since the last ceasefire. Let's remind our listeners, during the last ceasefire, Israel let in, do you remember off the top of your head how many tons of aid?
It was 450,000.
450,000 tons of aid aboard 25,200 trucks, exactly, I counted, which is a third of all the aid that went in during the war, went in a 6-week period. Israel says there's enough to last for several months. If there are shortages and people aren't getting the food, it's because Hamas has been hijacking it. And we see, while the UN claims that its warehouses are running low, markets are full because it's been sold onto the black market. And what you, Western taxpayers, have been paying to give us aid is being sold to people, and someone is making an absolute killing, and I use that word intentionally, in the middle. Anyway, it repeats this allegation that food is being used as a weapon of war, and says that food should not be used as a weapon. But then it says that reconstruction should be used as a weapon. What is The Economist's big idea? I quote, America should apply pressure to Hamas using the strongest remaining tool at its disposal, reconstruction. The UN estimates this will cost $53 billion over the next decade. Mr. Trump should issue an ultimatum. Donors should not pledge $1 until Hamas agrees to cede power and disarm. America's allies will need little convincing. Most want Hamas gone. What The Economist is saying is, it's outrageous and illegal and immoral to withhold food, but withholding construction materials, that's okay, right? The war should end, and no one should rebuild anything in Gaza until Hamas agrees to disarm. Do we have any reason to think that Hamas will disarm? Do you think The Economist thinks that this pressure will work?
No.
No, it doesn't. The Economist then says the odds are that Hamas will try to cling to power. So The Economist proposes a solution that's based on weaponizing reconstruction, admits it won't work, and then it says, ho-ho, but it will have to answer to its own people. Thousands of Gazans have already joined protests demanding its ousting. Perhaps their ranks will swell. Perfectly speculative. So its solution is we need to condition reconstruction on Hamas disarming. If Hamas doesn't disarm, then there might be a Gazan revolution to overthrow Hamas. And if that doesn't work, can you guess what they say next? And if Hamas ever posed a serious threat to Israel, then Israel would be entitled to strike again. Which means The Economist is saying, here's a proposal in which we're going to weaponize reconstruction, as if you would be able to stop the international pressure to go on and rebuild anyway, despite Hamas still being there. Here's a solution that's probably not going to work, a Gazan revolution against Hamas. And then we're probably going to go back to war, and then Israel will have a right to respond again, as if, I mean, if I had a penny for every time I heard, well, that round of conflict is over. If Hamas ever attacks Israel again, then Israel will have a right.
That was the argument.
Exactly the whole point of the disengagement was Israel pulls out of Gaza, saying if a single rocket falls over, then we'll be entitled to thump Hamas. And every time there's pressure every time there is pressure to leave Hamas standing. I'm wondering what you think of this editorial and the thought process that says aggression against Israel from Hamas should never have a cost, okay? And Israel, and let's separate this from the discussion about the hostages, but this argument that says that there is some other way to make Hamas disarm and to remove it from power other than military strategy. Is there? Because the Economist puts forward its best case and says the odds are it's not going to work.
This is a classic example of people from abroad, but to be honest, it happens also among Israeli experts as well. People who have no idea how things work on the ground, who refuse to learn from history, including very recent history, and who discount or just are not capable of understanding the role of ideology, the role of religious beliefs, the role of systems of fear. We've already seen that Hamas is arguing that what is humanitarian aid? So food is humanitarian aid, fuel, reconstructing hospitals is humanitarian aid. Well, then we need cement because we have to reconstruct the hospital. And we need heavy equipment because you can't reconstruct a hospital without heavy equipment. So the question of what is humanitarian aid will quickly be expanded to provide Hamas fertilizer. We have to grow crops. That's humanitarian aid. We can't be dependent. That will quickly grow, and Hamas, doesn't matter what kind of Gaza reconstruction mechanism you have, Hamas has always and will always be able to use whatever comes into the Strip for its own use. Again, unless you have what Israel has proposed or America has proposed, this totally separate mechanism. But any kind of construction will end up in the hands of Hamas. Look, we had people on October 6th, or in the year, 2 years leading up to October 7th, saying with total confidence that the more economic development there is in the Gaza Strip, the more Gazan workers come into Israel, the more goods are coming in and out, that will lead Hamas to moderate because they will want to, that was the idea of the carrots and sticks approach of then Prime Minister Yair Lapid. On October 6th, there were more Gazans working in Israel, bringing money from Israel back into the Gaza Strip than ever before. Over the last several years, accelerated under Prime Ministers Bennett and Lapid, but even before that under Prime Minister Netanyahu as well.
The thinking was, we'll give them something to lose. And you would have to be crazy to have to launch a war.
They were allowing more and more goods, types of goods, into the Gaza Strip, fiberglass to repair boats, even though that was being used to build missiles. And of course, all of these false ideas and false paradigms blew up on our face in October 7th, because people have a trouble understanding and realizing that Hamas is truly dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel and to killing as many Israelis, as many Jews as possible. Now, we've seen the protesters, and they're courageous, and we can only salute them and wish them all success. But the bottom line is that the median age in Gaza is 18 years. Hamas took over the Gaza Strip 18 years ago. That means that half the population has only gone through Hamas schools, Hamas media, Hamas mosques.
That's not fair. They went through UN schools as well.
That's true.
The UN produced the October 7th monsters. By the way, the youngest terrorists who took part in the October 7th massacre were born after the Israeli withdrawal. They were born into the reality in which Israel gave the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians and said, please try to prove that you can do something useful here instead of turning it into a mini Al-Qaeda state. And they did.
By the way, the latest Palestinian polls also show that Hamas is by far the most popular party in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank as well. The support for Hamas among the Gazan population, among the Palestinian population, is real. It's not uniform, but it's deep, it's widespread, and it is a part of a real religious belief, ideological belief, identity of the goals, of the means. We can't discount that.
Yeah, now, I saw someone came after someone on Twitter saying, there's this tactic in pro-Israel circles to try to suggest that Hamas and the Palestinians are the same, that that Hamas represents the Palestinians. They don't. I'm like, well, a plurality of Palestinians believe that Hamas represents them. Before Sinwar was killed, he was beating the incumbent president Abbas 3-1 in the polls. The fact is, maybe not a majority, definitely not everyone, right? Definitely not everyone. But a sizable portion of the Palestinian population does believe that Hamas's narrative of jihad, of violent struggle against the state of Israel because it is a colonial regime that will eventually disappear is a reflection of their national ethos. And that's part of what needs to be dealt with the day after, the de-radicalization.
Absolutely. And that has to be de-radicalization. That has to be taken into account when thinking about what's possible. So is Hamas going to disarm for Reconstruction? No, it won't. It will use Reconstruction to strengthen its... And it retains, fortunately or unfortunately, it retains significant support in the Gaza Strip.
Hamas retains significant support not only within the Gaza Strip, but in a global network of international institutions and organizations that have a veneer of respectability against which it's very difficult to argue because they have big fancy names with the word international in it. But the fact is staffed by people who do not think that Hamas is an illegitimate terrorist organization that must be crushed, that didn't shed a crocodile tear on October 7th and say, Israel, you go after Hamas, just be careful to obey the rules of international law, and have been gunning since the very beginning to try to keep Hamas in power in some way or another. They've done immense damage to Israel by running interference for Hamas. One of them is the International Criminal Court. This week, the Wall Street Journal published a bombshell report. And I will say for listeners, the following conversation is going to contain some uncomfortable details about sexual abuse. So if you're sensitive to that, you may want to switch podcast right now. The prosecutor, Karim Khan, is accused by at least one staffer at the International Criminal Court, multiple allegations of coerced sexual intercourse. That sounds like a polite way to say rape. Multiple occasions, he always holds me on and leads me to the bed, she said in testimony which was reviewed by the Wall Street Journal. It's the feeling of being trapped. And what the Wall Street Journal reveals is that just 2.5 weeks after Khan learned of the allegations against him of rape by a staffer, he surprised Israeli and US officials by announcing the most dramatic warrant in the court's history for Prime Minister Netanyahu and for the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. And it appears that we have a suspected sex pest, alleged rapist, using the power of the court to try to cover up those allegations. It gets really shocking because it says that he told this woman, he managed to persuade her not to push ahead with the allegations because look what it would do to Palestine. So he used, allegedly, he denies this of course, he used the allegations against Israel not only to cover up the allegations against him, but also to quieten down the allegations against him by continuing to subject this poor woman, allegedly again, to serious blackmail, essentially. I mean, it's shocking this man is still in his role given the cloud of allegations above him.
It's absolutely shocking. We've seen again and again UN officials, international officials engaging in the most egregious anti-Semitism, in the most egregious, even borderline criminal activity. And because of their anti-Israel activity, they maintain the support of important international actors, important international media outlets. But it is incredible that he is still in his role.
But this seems to be reflective not just of the problem with the ICC, the broader international system. Look at the ICJ. The president of the ICJ, while Israel was being hauled in front of the court, was running for political office in Lebanon at the same time. He's pronouncing judgment on Israel at the same time as trying to become prime minister of Lebanon. And now Nawaf Salam is the prime minister of Lebanon. How that case at the ICJ has not been thrown out is a wonder to me. But what I really struggle to understand is why our friends in the West don't understand that these are not impartial, objective courts. These are political courts. There is a political campaign being waged against Israel. And how these courts still maintain that veneer of legitimacy where, you know, I can still go in an interview and be told, well, the ICJ has said, fine. So someone who was running for prime minister of an enemy state said, like, so what? Why am I meant to care about that? Why do you pretend that this organization still has a veneer of legitimacy? Even after, you know, organizations like UK Lawyers for Israel did such a fantastic job of breaking down those requests for arrest warrants, showing how every single line was based on a misrepresentation of fact. But they keep this halo effect, and that halo effect is so powerful in convincing people and continuing this information war against Israel.
Absolutely. It's a very, very powerful effect. And we see in general that people who are associated as judges or justices or legal experts tend to be seen as non-political. When, and often, as we've seen in this blatant case of of Lebanon, they are often explicitly political and are thinking about their political goals, or in Karim Khan's case, potentially his desire to avoid criminal allegations. One of the challenges that we've seen is that the people who are often making the accusations against Israel are academics, think tanks, civil society activists, media commentators who have no actual experience and also no actual responsibility for protecting the lives of civilians from terror. If you look at what the militaries of major democracies actually do, their actions, Israel's actions certainly are in accord with what they do and often go above and beyond what they do. So you need to look at how do these militaries, how do they explicitly declare that they understand and interpret international conventions to which they are party. And we'll see that their approaches are much more realistic. And why? Because they don't want to allow, terrorists also know international law. They know how to work international media. They know how to manipulate the international discourse. And they are explicitly choosing their tactics in order to use these kinds of tools, use the language of international law, humanitarian aid, international media discourse, in order to make their attacks more effective and defend themselves.
Because what's going on behind the scenes here is that Hamas will deliberately violate international law to trying to get the protections of international law because it knows that the gatekeepers will spin whatever Israel is doing as a violation of international law. There's no international law it can break where people will say, oh, well, you fought a war out of a hospital. Well, under the Geneva Conventions, then, Israel may be entitled to strike. No matter what Israel does, Hamas knows that it will have the support of these supposedly neutral gatekeepers.
Absolutely. Look, also, what's the best way to get a lot of followers on social media? Bash Israel. What's the best way for an Israeli?
My social media has been flatlining. Maybe I'll try it. Maybe it'll work.
If you're an Israeli academic that hasn't made it in other places and you want to move ahead academically in a European institution, bash Israel. If you are a young legal expert and you want to move ahead in the international court system, bash Israel.
I just want to be clear to our listeners: this is not career advice. This is not intended. Do not do this at home.
Unfortunately, that's a fact. There's also there's lots of money for those kinds of activities. If you set up an NGO, the NGO that's looking to arrest Israelis, looking to condemn Israelis, it's relatively easy to raise money, to get money from European governments, from various foundations. It's not a bad business.
What do we do about it? What do we do about these organizations that seem just so completely broken and beyond repair? When you were a senior official at the Strategic Affairs Ministry, it was Gilad Edan at the time, right? So Gilad Edan later became the ambassador at the United Nations. I heard him last week at a conference in Jerusalem, the JNS Summit, in which he said the UN should just be dissolved. The goal now should be to try to convince the Trump administration to defund the US, shut it down, just as the League of Nations collapsed and something better, at least originally, took its place, the United Nations. The organization is just rotten beyond repair, needs to be shut down and replaced. I wonder what you make of that.
The UN was established after the League of Nations failed to promote international peace and security. And it's clearly failing in that goal as well. And who is paying for this huge, corrupt, expensive bureaucracy? Primarily the United States. Officially, it's giving about 24% of the UN's budget. Unofficially, it's probably closer to 30 to 40%, around $19 billion a year. There are certainly much better ways that the United States can work with its democratic allies and partners to promote peace and democracy, to promote a Western-aligned world order, to counter the activities of hostile actors, whether they're terrorists, whether they're hostile countries. There is a much better way for America and its allies, Israel, countries in Europe, countries in the Middle East that truly favor peace and cooperation, to work together to actually achieve the goals that the UN is supposed to achieve, rather than paying the salaries for thousands and thousands of bureaucrats, which, if they're doing anything, it's often promoting international disorder and promoting international security and whitewashing terrorist crimes.
Yeah, people say, the UN said, the UN said. The UN is majority non-democratic countries. This is not a league of democracies. This includes all the world's dictatorships, some of which are very powerful and manage to get key seats on various committees. And I think from our perspective, it's challenging because it has such a halo effect around it that it's very difficult to combat that reputation that it has, as if this is, as they say in Hebrew, Torah Sinai, as if this is like Moses coming down from Mount Sinai. Asher, really been good speaking to you. How can people follow you and your work on social media?
You can follow me on X at @FredmanA or on LinkedIn as well. And also I would urge everybody to follow the Misgav Institute for National Security. not objective, but I believe Israel's most influential national security policy center.
Just so biased.
Focus on all of the most important issues, whether it's Gaza, Iran, whether it's expanding regional peace and cooperation. So I'd urge you to follow the Misgav Institute on social media and our website as well. And it's been such a great pleasure, Eylon.
Okay, Asher Fredman, we're ending this podcast not with any, brilliant breakthroughs that now we have the perfect solution to apart from that, but I hope that what people take away is not that we've come with some brilliant idea of we know the perfect path forward, but help better understand the impossible dilemmas and complexities that Israeli society is navigating. Israel will have to make some very dramatic decisions. That's okay, we have no choice, you have to make decisions, but we at least have to understand what the cost really is so that we're going into them completely clear-eyed. Asher Fredman, thank you for joining me on the show.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for this episode of State of a Nation with me, Eylon Levy. As always, if you enjoy these episodes, give us a like, share with a friend, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or what's the other one? YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to sponsor an episode of this podcast, please get in touch with me, Eylon A. Levy, on social media or with the podcast. This episode was produced by Asher Westrop Evans, directed and edited by Benny Goldman. I'm Eylon Levy, and thanks for joining us.